It was a quiet afternoon, with nothing unusual expected. The park was alive with children's laughing, and the sun cast a pleasant glow over the surrounding neighborhood. However, life has a way of upsetting tranquility in the most unexpected and painful ways. In a second, a child's laughing transformed into anguished calls for rescue. A billionaire's vicious dog, known for its nasty temper, rushed at an innocent boy, leaving him hurt and afraid. The scenario was chaotic, with passers-by stopped in disbelief, the boy's cries booming through the air, and the billionaire's indifferent attitude exacerbating the situation. He dismissed it, blaming the child for being in the wrong location at the wrong time. However, this was not simply about a dog attack. It was about power, privilege, and the consequences of disregarding what is right. The billionaire's callous attitude enraged the boy's father, but it also fueled an even stronger desire to defend his son and pursue justice. What no one realized was that this father was keeping a secret, one so powerful that it may change everything. Beneath his peaceful exterior was a guy who had spent years working as a highly trained FBI agent, keeping his true identity disguised to protect his family. Now, that secret was going to be revealed in the most spectacular way. As his kid lay in the hospital, the father felt a range of emotions: anguish for his son's suffering, rage at the billionaire's callousness, and a strong desire to make things right. Meanwhile, the millionaire continued to flaunt his fortune, convinced that his authority could shield him from any consequences. However, when the father exposes his true identity, everything changes. The billionaire, who is accustomed to being untouchable, is forced to confront the law and the moral ramifications of his conduct. This story is about love, sacrifice, and how far a parent would go to protect their child. It demonstrates that, no matter how much power or privilege someone possesses, the truth will eventually be revealed, and when it does, it may turn everything upside down. Prepare for a stunning voyage that will make you reconsider justice, humanity, and redemption. The billionaire's home was a world of unbelievable wealth, a place where dreams of luxury came true. But for those who didn't belong, it was a fortress of fear. Sprawling gardens stretched indefinitely, their vivid blooms forming a flawless facade of beauty. Every flower and fountain seemed to tell a story of extravagance, a life far apart from the sufferings of ordinary people. At the center of it all was the mansion, a towering emblem of power and fortune. Its marble walls sparkled in the sunlight, almost blinding, as if challenging anyone to look closer. Inside, through the large windows, glimpses of grandeur greeted the eye: crystal chandeliers twinkling like stars, golden accents adorning every corner, and priceless artwork hanging as silent witnesses to a life most people could never conceive. But underneath the stunning beauty was an air of anxiety. The estate was more than just a mansion. It was an empire founded on hubris and power. A large guard dog prowled the grounds, its piercing eyes searching for any indication of intruders. Every stride it made was deliberate, and its snarl was a low, terrifying reminder of the perils hiding beyond the estate's flawless facade. For those who ventured to get too close, the dog was more than just a guard. It was a weapon, trained to defend the billionaire's stronghold at all costs. Its presence was not only frightening, it was terrifying, especially for a youngster who may approach too close, oblivious of the danger that awaited. The estate portrayed a story of extremes, unbelievable wealth for one, and fear for anybody who ventured to question it. It was a realm where power reigned supreme. The vulnerable were invisible, and one incorrect move could change everything in an instant. The millionaire was a man who created his own universe, one marked by wealth, power, and a sense of superiority that he wore as a crown. His name was synonymous with success, dominating headlines and whispering in boardrooms. To others, he represented ambition, but to those who genuinely knew him, he was a man consumed by ego and an unwavering confidence in his own importance. Dressed in fitted suits that cost more than most people's annual wages, he exuded authority and made everyone else feel insignificant. His sharp, hard, and calculating eyes assessed people for utility rather than worth. He saw life as a game in which he was always the winner. He surrounded himself with luxury, but his actual wealth came from his influence over others. He negotiated deals with the flick of a wrist, and his decisions changed, or ruined, people's lives. He traveled about the world unaffected by regular people's concerns, dismissing their difficulties as the result of their own mistakes. Those who crossed his way frequently felt the sting of his disdain. He had no patience for weakness, and no sympathy for those who couldn't keep up with his never-ending desire of more. He saw people as either advantages or barriers, and he handled them accordingly. But beneath the polished facade was a guy driven by his own ego, unaware of the ramifications of his actions. He imagined himself as untouchable, a monarch in a world that he assumed revolved around him. What he didn't comprehend was that even kings may fall, and the people he looked down on could be the ones who bring him down. The father and son walked side by side, their bond visible in every shared laugh and soft conversation. The boy's small hand was snuggled into his father's, his face filled with the unrestrained delight that only childhood can provide. They strolled around the peaceful neighborhood, enjoying the sunny afternoon, completely unconscious of the storm that was about to disrupt their tranquility. The father, a humble and industrious man, treasured these memories with his son. Life had not always been easy, but his love for his child remained unwavering, a guiding light through every adversity. He looked down at his son, his heart bursting with pride as the toddler pointed out a butterfly fluttering by, his enthusiasm contagious. To the youngster, his father was a hero, providing warmth and security. To the father, his son represented everything nice and innocent in life. Together, they painted a picture of love and purity, in stark contrast to the evil that lurked ahead. As they traveled, they passed towering gates and enormous estates, their simple joy unaffected by the wealth and power around them. But fate had different intentions. A shadow lurked just beyond those gates, waiting to cross their path, putting the father's courage and love to the ultimate test. They had no idea that their quiet walk would soon devolve into mayhem, and that their friendship would be challenged in ways they never imagined. For the time being, they were just a father and son, basking in the sun's warmth and the comfort of each other's company, blissfully unconscious of the storm that was about to change everything. The boy's curiosity was as limitless as his energy. As they strolled past the billionaire's estate's high gates, his eyes widened as he saw the huge gardens and majestic mansion beyond. It seemed like something out of a novel, a wonderful setting that drew him in. "Wow, Dad, look at that!" he shouted, pulling on his father's hand and pointing through the iron bars of the fence. His father grinned, charmed by his son's enthusiasm, but gently urged him to remain close. But the boy's playful side got the best of him. When he saw a vividly colorful butterfly fluttering near the estate's fence, he let go of his father's hand and ran for it. His tiny feet drew him closer to the high gate, and his laughter rang out as he pursued the delicate creature. "Be careful, son," his father said, his voice filled with concern. But the youngster was enthralled in the moment, reaching out with his tiny fingers as the butterfly danced just out of reach. Step by step, he approached the fence, his naive wonder blinding him to the danger that lay beyond. Behind the fence, the estate's guard dog moved, its ears perked up, and its sharp eyes focused on the boy's little physique. A deep growl rumbled in its throat, undetected among the child's chuckles. The dog's movements were gradual at first, almost deliberate, as it began to prowl toward the fence, its presence becoming more intimidating with each passing second. The child was continued following the butterfly, ignorant to the impending danger. His father, realizing something was awry, took a step forward, his pulse racing as he saw the dog's shadow approaching. "Son, come back here," he exclaimed, his voice urgent now. Unfortunately, it was too late. The youngster had gotten too close to the fence, and his innocent curiosity set off a chain reaction that neither he nor his father could have predicted. A sharp, ferocious bark rang across the neighborhood, shattering the tranquil atmosphere. The child froze, his tiny figure shivering as he turned to see the big guard dog charging towards the fence. Its sharp teeth glittered, and its growls became louder and more savage with each stride. "Dad!" the youngster shouted, his voice breaking with dread as he fell backward and tripped over his own feet. He fell to the ground, his small hands scraping across the tarmac as the dog lunged at the fence, its strong body crashing at the iron bars with such force that they rattled. The dog's barks were unrelenting, each one scarier than the previous. It clawed at the ground, pacing and lunging, as if the fence couldn't withstand its rage. The boy's wide eyes welled up with tears, his former fascination replaced by genuine dread as he fought to get away. "Stay back," his father yelled, his voice booming with urgency as he ran for his son. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming to defend the child he loved above all else. The father reached his son in seconds, snatching him up in his arms and clutching him close. The boy clung to him, his tiny hands grabbing his father's shirt as sobbing ran down his small body. The dog continued to scream and snarl, its rage unwavering, its terrifying presence a clear reminder of how swiftly innocence can change to horror. The father turned, sheltering his youngster with his body as he moved away from the barrier, his protective instincts heightened. "It's okay. I've got you," he said softly, his voice shaking with emotion as he hugged his kid tightly. But his gaze returned to the mansion, rage and terror rising within him as the dog's barking faded into the distance. This was not an ordinary experience. It was a moment that would leave scars, not only on the youngster, but also on his father's heart. And it was just the beginning of a story neither of them could have predicted. The billionaire emerged from the mansion's magnificent entryway, his sharp eyes surveying the area with displeasure and irritation. His carefully cut suit gleamed in the sunlight as he stepped out onto the marble stairs, the ruckus disrupting the peace of his estate. At first, he stayed there, watching the turmoil unfold in front of him, his guard dog still growling, the boy shaking in his father's arms, and the father's protective posture. However, instead of hurrying to investigate the situation and showing compassion for the terrified child, his countenance hardened into one of annoyance. "What's all this noise?" he mumbled, his voice full of anger. He waved his hand dismissively, as if the incident were only a little annoyance. He took a few steps forward, his eyes narrowing as he gazed at the father and boy, his expression icy and indifferent. "Your child provoked the dog," he remarked, his tone oozing with contempt. "What happens when you let them get too close to the fence? It is not the dog's fault." The father's heart tightened with rage, but he kept his tongue, focusing solely on his son. The boy, still clinging to him, appeared disturbed, his small body shivering with dread. The billionaire's statements were like a punch in the face, criticizing a child for being interested and innocent. He continued, his voice casual, as if the occurrence were only a small bother to him. "You should teach your child to avoid dangerous animals," he said, his attention flicking dismissively toward the father. "It is common sense. This estate is privately owned. If you don't want trouble, stay out." His remarks stayed in the air, icy and cutting, as he returned to his mansion, without looking back at his father or son. The door of the mansion closed with a quiet click, the sound echoing like the last nail in the coffin. The father stood there, visibly frustrated and disbelieving, but said nothing. He had no words for a man who could be so cold, so unconcerned about the fear and anguish his dog had inflicted. All that mattered now was keeping his son safe and shielding him from a society that appeared all too quick to dismiss their significance. The father's heart raced as he cradled his infant in his arms, his protective instincts taking over. The boy's body shivered against him, his small hands still grasping his father's shirt, as if he could cling on indefinitely and erase the terror he had just endured. The father hugged his infant to his chest in quick, delicate strokes, his head racing and his heart heavy with fear. He crouched down and gently lowered the boy to his lap as he examined him, his hands quivering slightly as he ran them over the child's arms and legs. "Are you okay, buddy?" he questioned, his voice gentle but full of anxiety. His eyes scoured his son's face for any evidence of injury, such as marks left by the dog's frantic lunging. The boy's tear-filled eyes met his own, and for a minute, the world appeared to slow. The youngster nodded shakily, but his voice was scarcely audible. "I'm scared, Daddy." The father's chest constricted at the sound of his son's dread, but he attempted a calm smile while stroking a stray lock of hair off the boy's brow. "I understand, son. I understand. But you're safe now. I got you." His hands roamed gently over his son's body, looking for scrapes, bruises, and anything else that might have gone unnoticed in the stress. His touch was soft, each action imbued with love and care, as if it could protect the youngster from the agony they had just experienced. He discovered a few scrapes on the boy's hands where he had fallen, but nothing major. Nonetheless, his heart wrenched at the sight. He kissed the top of his son's head and held him close, feeling the warmth of his small body against his. The world around them appeared to slip away, as did the billionaire's statements of fear, rage, and brutality. At this point, there was only the father and son, bonded together by love and an unspoken promise. No matter what happened, he would always protect his child. "Don't worry, son," the father said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "You'll be okay. I will not let anything happen to you." Despite the billionaire's nasty words, the father maintained his composure as he clutched his son close. On the surface, he appeared calm, his voice smooth and soothing as he consoled the kid. But beneath the placid appearance, his eyes revealed a deeper intensity, a simmering rage that became hotter with each passing second. The billionaire's dismissive attitude toward the circumstance, his complete lack of empathy for the child's distress, sparked something in the father. But he kept everything under control, focusing all of his energy on his baby, making sure he felt safe and loved in his arms. He realized this wasn't a confrontation. It was about protecting his son and keeping him from becoming filled with dread. Still, His gaze returned to the home, where the billionaire had vanished inside the gates, his arrogance remaining in the air. The father's jaw clenched, his mind running with ideas of how easily power could be abused, how easily a life might be ignored by people who believed they were untouchable. However, he did not act on it. Not yet. He realized now wasn't the time. His son needed him, and that was his sole concentration. But the intensity in his eyes was a promise. This would not go unanswered. The father tightened his grip on his son, his protective instincts rushing through him like a tidal wave. He was enraged, not just by the attack, but also by the billionaire's treatment of them, by reducing his son to nothing more than a nuisance in the eyes of someone who had everything. But he didn't let his rage engulf him. Instead, he turned anger into a calm resolve. He would ensure that this was not forgotten. He would ensure that his son never felt little or insignificant again. And eventually, the millionaire would realize that no amount of wealth or power could protect him from the consequences of his actions. For the time being, however, the father hugged his son close, providing him with the comfort and safety that the billionaire never would. The world around them may be cold and harsh, but in this moment, the father's love was more powerful than everything else. The billionaire stood in the entryway of his estate, his back straight and posture as firm as his sense of dominance. His gaze swept across the scene, father and son still huddled together in the distance, before he turned away, dismissing them with a flick of his wrist, as if they were nothing more than an irritating disturbance to his immaculate world. Just another nobody, he whispered to himself, his lips curving into a sneer. The words were delivered with contempt, as if the father and kid were just blips in the big scheme of things, inconsequential and undeserving of his time. To him, they were just another example of the world's lesser individuals, those who lacked the resources or authority to make a difference. He gazed down at the ground, his mind already straying back to the pleasures of his estate, the power he wielded, and the people who admired him from afar. What is the problem with the dog? A minor discomfort. Why is the father so angry? Irrelevant. Turning his back on the sight, the millionaire proceeded deeper inside the estate, his voice echoing as he spoke with his secretary. "I don't have time for this," he replied, his tone icy and determined. "It's not my fault if a fool can't control his child. He should have kept the brat off my property." He paused, his gaze tightening with irritation. "I am not responsible for anything that happens on my property. The dog was performing its job. If they are unable to manage it, that is their fault." His comments were harsh, cutting through the air with the same arrogance that had characterized his entire existence. Responsibility, accountability. To him, those were concepts saved for the weak, those who couldn't safeguard what they had. The millionaire didn't care about the father's pain or his son's terror. They were just another hassle, another set of people who did not deserve his attention or regard. As the father and son stood in the distance, attempting to recover from the shock, the billionaire's thoughts had already shifted to the next purchase, acquisition, or step in his ever-expanding business. Nothing could ever modify his perception of himself as untouchable. The father stood there for a few moments, his son still cradled in his arms, trembling but comforted by his father's presence. The atmosphere around them felt thick, tense from the billionaire's cruel comments. Despite his indignation, the father maintained his cool. His voice was calm and steady, but it carried a quiet firmness that demanded attention. He turned to face the billionaire, who had already fled to the safety of his mansion. The father took a deep breath, His eyes narrowed in resolve. This was about more than just the attack on his son. It was about standing up to someone who thought they were above reproach and the consequences of their conduct. "Sir," the father said, his voice filled with quiet authority, "you might think you're untouchable, that you can treat people like they don't matter, but you're wrong." The millionaire hesitated, his hand resting on the doorframe as he looked back, apparently angered by being interrupted. He looked down at the father dismissively, but the father's gaze remained unflinching. "You may have all the money and power, but that does not make you right," the father said, his words measured, but full of quiet fury. "You have injured my son, and you cannot simply walk away from that. You should evaluate your conduct, because there are consequences for everything, no matter how far you believe you've climbed." The billionaire's lips twitched, producing a small sneer as he turned to face the father directly. However, the father did not flinch. He stood tall, protecting his son with an unyielding voice. "I refuse to let you disregard this. You might pretend that your wealth elevates you above everyone else, but it does not make you indestructible. You have crossed a line, and I will not let it go undetected." They had a brief moment of silence. The billionaire's eyes blazed with annoyance, but behind the surface, something else flickered. Perhaps a recognition that this wasn't just another powerless man he could dismiss. The father's words hung in the air as a warning and a promise. He wasn't about to let this go. Not now. Not ever. The billionaire's eyes glowed with delight as he heard the father's admonition. He let out a shrill, sarcastic chuckle that echoed through the air like a bitter, contemptuous sound. He turned completely toward the father, his posture exuding contempt, a sneer twisting his lips. "Oh, please," the billionaire muttered, his voice full of derision. "You think I'm going to be intimidated by some nobody with a kid who doesn't know how to stay out of trouble?" He chuckled again, a frigid, unfunny sound. "I've seen people like you all my life. People who think they can stand up to me, but it's all just noise." He took a step forward, his gaze narrowing as he assessed the father, his eyes full with scorn. "You're nothing," he replied plainly, his tone crisp and deliberate. "Just another face in the crowd who believes they can make a difference. But you will not. You are too insignificant." The father held his stance, his demeanor calm, yet unyielding. The billionaire's mocking tone appeared to strengthen his calm resolve. However, the billionaire was not done. "You think your little warning means anything to me?" he asked, his voice low and contemptuous. "You're simply a man with no power, influence, or ability to do anything about it. You're just a parent attempting to protect his son, and in the end, it won't matter. I am untouchable." He waved his hand dismissively, as if to remove himself from the father's presence. "Go ahead, take your boy, and go. It isn't worth my time. You cannot touch me, and nothing you say will alter that." With that, the billionaire turned on his heel, back to the father, swinging open the door to his mansion and disappearing inside its formidable walls. His laughter lingered in the air, a reminder of the power he thought he had over everyone else, and how disconnected he was from the consequences of his actions. But as the father saw him retreat, his eyes hardening with determination, he realized this wasn't over. The billionaire's mocking fueled his determination. He wouldn't let it go. Not now. Not ever. As the billionaire turned away, dismissing him with a final sneer, the father took a measured step forward. His gaze, still fixed on the mansion's door, maintained a quiet intensity that appeared to deepen with each passing second. The air surrounding them seemed electric, and the tension was evident. The millionaire, unaware of the change, was already heading back toward the door, his back turned, when the father's voice broke the silence. Calm, measured, but with irrefutable force. "You're wrong," the father remarked, his tone firm. The billionaire paused mid-step, his hand still on the doorframe, and slowly turned. His eyes narrowed, and an amused smirk played at the corners of his mouth as he returned his gaze to the father. "Oh? And why do you think I'm wrong?" The father's eyes did not waver. He stood straighter now, the wrath and frustration of the past replaced with a quiet, controlled authority that could not be ignored. "I'm not just some nobody," the father remarked quietly but firmly, "and I'm certainly not someone you can dismiss so easily." For a brief moment, the billionaire's sneer faltered, and a flash of confusion crossed his features. But the father persisted, his words firm, bearing the weight of a truth that would change everything. "I'm an undercover FBI agent," he explained, each word careful and full of significance. "And you've just made a very big mistake." The billionaire froze, his countenance changing from arrogance to shock. The silence between them became longer, and the sound of his own breath became more audible. The father's comments weighed heavily on him, and the truth dawned on him slowly and unsettlingly. The father did not flinch. He didn't need to say any more. The billionaire's demeanor changed, and the confidence he had exhibited was replaced with a subtle anxiety. The man who had formerly considered himself untouchable and above reproach now faced someone considerably more dangerous than he had thought. "I don't know what you think you can get away with," the father said, his gaze never leaving the billionaire's. "But the law does not bend for anyone, not even for you." The billionaire opened his mouth, but no words emerged. His smirk had vanished, replaced by a frightened expression. For the first time, the father noticed true physical terror creeping into the billionaire's eyes. The father's lips formed a faint, knowing smile. He'd made his point, and, despite his wealth and power, the billionaire had finally recognized that money could not protect him from certain things. The father held firm as the billionaire's uncertainty worsened. The tension in the air was intense, almost suffocating, as the father's words set in. But, with a gentle serenity, the father took another step closer, his gaze never leaving the billionaire's. He was not done yet. "I wasn't in this neighborhood by chance," the father continued, his voice firm and each syllable meaningful. "I have been watching you for a long time." The billionaire's face twitched, his eyes narrowing in suspicion, but the father's expression stayed the same. There was no indication of uncertainty or doubt. "You believe you can hide behind your wealth and power," the father said, his tone becoming colder. "But nothing escapes the gaze of the law. I've been here gathering information and monitoring every move you make." The billionaire's lips parted, and a flash of panic appeared in his eyes. He had always considered himself to be untouchable, protected by his wealth and influence. However, when confronted with a man who had been silently studying him all along, that illusion crumbled. The father's stare sharpened, and his remarks were slow and deliberate. "The dog, the arrogance, the way you treat others as if they aren't important. It all adds up. You've been crossing lines, and I've been waiting for the proper time to make you pay for it." The billionaire's breath seized in his throat, and his composure slipped. The father was not merely a concerned dad. He wasn't simply a man whose son had been attacked. No, this man was there for a reason, one far greater than the billionaire could have anticipated. The father's gaze quickly shifted to his son, who was still safely held in his arms, before returning to the billionaire. You committed a mistake today that you will not let go of. And now, you'll have to face the consequences." The billionaire opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged. His thoughts raced, attempting to comprehend what was going on, what this man, this agent, had just divulged. Unfortunately, it was too late. The truth had been revealed, and the father's quiet authority had crushed the billionaire's illusion of invincibility. In that moment, the father realized there was no turning back. The game had changed, and the billionaire's arrogance was finally finished. The father stood erect, his remarks bearing the weight of all that had been accumulating behind the scenes. The billionaire, still reeling from the shock of the discovery, could only gaze at him, trying to make sense of what was happening. "You've been living in a world where you believe your money will protect you from everything," the father replied, his voice firm, his gaze never leaving the billionaire's. "But this is not the case. The FBI has been watching you for months." As the truth dawned on the billionaire, his face paled and his confidence wavered. The father's statements were not mere threats. They represented the reality he had been attempting to avoid, the truth he had been blind to. "We've been building a case against you," the father said, his gaze piercing. "We've been looking into your illicit dealings and unethical business methods, which you've been hiding behind your mansion. You thought you could get away with it by hiding behind your wealth, but you were mistaken." The billionaire's tongue dried up, his arrogance giving way to a mounting sense of panic. He took a step back, but the father's presence was like a wall, immovable and unbreakable. The father did not flinch or give an inch. "We've been tracking every move you've made," the father continued, his voice low and steady. "The money laundering, the unlawful transactions, the people you've manipulated and abandoned like pieces in your game. We have it all. And now, it is time for you to face the consequences." The billionaire's breath quickened, and his thoughts raced as he attempted to comprehend the immensity of what was happening. His empire, which had been constructed on lies and deceit, was crumbling in front of his eyes. The father's calm manner and gentle authority in his voice contrasted sharply with the billionaire's growing terror. "You thought you were untouchable," the father added, his gaze fixed on the billionaire's. "However, no one is above the law. Not even you." The billionaire's hands trembled slightly as he went for the door, but the father took a dominating stance. "You can't run away from this," he replied, his voice cutting through the billionaire's despair. "The FBI is already on its way. When they arrive, there will be no avoiding the reality." For a time, there was only quiet between them. The billionaire's world, which had once been so solid, was suddenly crumbling. The father, the undercover agent, had just dealt the ultimate blow. His life, fortune, and empire, everything he had strived for, were about to crumble. The father did not need to say anything else. The case had been established, the proof was available, and the billionaire's fate was sealed. The billionaire's arrogant look faded as the father's remarks set in. His hubris, which had previously radiated from every fiber of his being, began to shatter. The arrogant sneer that had been pasted on his face just moments before slowly faded, replaced with a rising terror. His breath caught as the full weight of the situation sunk in. The father wasn't simply a concerned dad. He wasn't just a man advocating for his son. No, he was an FBI agent, someone who had been watching, waiting, and now had him trapped. The billionaire's chest clenched as his heart pounded inside his ears. The world seemed to be closing in on him, and for the first time in years, he felt small. vulnerable. He took a step back, his mind racing as he searched for an exit. However, there was no escape. The FBI had been preparing a case against him for several months. His single move, every illicit transaction, every shady deal, everything he believed he had carefully concealed, was suddenly revealed. His gaze went to the mansion's doors, the guards, and the world outside. But it was all futile. His wealth, position, and influence no longer mattered. The law had gotten up to him. The billionaire's worry was exacerbated by his father's calm and unshakable presence. The man in front of him was not an ordinary person. He was a symbol of everything the billionaire had attempted to avoid. And suddenly, there was nowhere to hide. The billionaire's hands trembled as he groped for his phone, his fingers dripping in sweat. But the father moved closer, his voice steely and final. "Do not bother. It is already over." For the first time in his life, the billionaire experienced true powerlessness. His thoughts raced, but all he could see was the inevitable. The FBI closing in, the empire he had created through lies and deception falling to dust. The father maintained a steady look and an unflinching expression. He didn't need to say anything else. The billionaire's arrogance had been destroyed, replaced with the harsh truth of his actions. And at that point, the billionaire realized he couldn't avoid the repercussions. The father stood immobile, his gaze never leaving the billionaire's, as panic persisted in the man's countenance. The billionaire attempted to restore control, but his typical confidence had disappeared, leaving him vulnerable. With a long breath, the father spoke again, his voice steady and serene, but bearing an evident weight. "You think this is just about the dog attack, don't you?" he asked, his words intentional and precisely selected to slice through the billionaire's disintegrating mask. The billionaire's eyes twitched, his lips parted as if to answer, but the father denied him the opportunity. "This," the father explained, his tone unwavering, "is about much more than a dog. This is about everything you have been hidden behind your mansion. The money laundering, the unlawful transactions, the people you've exploited for personal benefit." He waited to allow the words sink in. "You've crossed a line, and now it's time to face the consequences." The billionaire opened his mouth, but no words emerged. His thoughts raced, but it was too late. The father had already revealed the truth. There was no hiding it now. The criminal acts he had spent years meticulously concealing, believing they were beyond reach, were now being investigated. And it wasn't simply about a dog assaulting a youngster anymore. It was about the empire of lies he'd created, and the law was closing in. The father took another step forward, his expression steadfast. "You felt you could get away with it because your wealth would shield you from responsibility. But this isn't how it works. Your actions have implications beyond this episode. The FBI has been developing a case against you, and we now have everything we need." The billionaire's face was devoid of color, and his confidence was crushed. He had always assumed that he could buy his way out of any situation, and that no one would try to question him. But now, standing in front of his father, he knew how mistaken he had been. The father's eyes softened slightly, but his voice was stern. "You've hurt my son, and to that you will respond. But this is only the beginning for you. The law is coming for you, and no amount of money or power will prevent it." The millionaire took a step back, his body tense from fright. The father's comments hung in the air like a weighty sentence, and for the first time in his life, the billionaire felt completely powerless. He could no longer ignore the consequences of his conduct. The billionaire's face contorted in desperation, as the gravity of his situation finally hit him. His mind, once keen and analytical, was now grasping for a way out. He took a frenzied step toward the father, raising his hands in an ineffective attempt of appeasement. Wait, please," the millionaire said, his voice shaking with fear. I did not intend for any of this to happen. It was simply a mistake. The dog is trained, and you must understand. He has never done anything like this before." His comments came out in a flurry, each one imbued with a feeling of urgency, yet they simply made him appear more desperate. The father's gaze remained fixed, icy, and unrelenting. The billionaire's eyes raced about, his thoughts scrambling for any reason to bail himself out of the mess he had made. "Look, I'll make it right," he said, his tone suddenly begging. "I will pay for the medical bills and the trauma, whatever it takes. You set the price, and I'll give you it. I can make this go away." He dug into his pocket, his hands shaking as he drew out a large amount of money. "I can make all of this disappear," he stated with a strained voice. "I will compensate you, your son and family. You will not have to worry about anything. Just don't report it. Please." The father did not flinch. His countenance remained unreadable. The billionaire's attempts to purchase his way out appeared to exacerbate his desperation. He took another step forward, his voice becoming increasingly agitated. I'll contribute to your son's future, to his schooling. Do whatever you want. I can buy you anything you need. I can make this go away. Just don't contact the authorities. Please. You don't understand. This might ruin me. My business and reputation are everything I've worked for." The billionaire's comments were now a mishmash of excuses and half-finished promises. He wasn't the confident, impenetrable man he had been seconds before. Now, he was a man racing to keep whatever authority he believed he still had, throwing money and promises in every direction. "I can fix this," he insisted, his voice almost imploring. "I am a powerful man. You do not want to do this. Think about what you are doing to me. You're going to regret it." But the father's eyes stayed calm and his attitude firm. There was no trace of uncertainty or doubt. The billionaire's desperate attempts to bribe and justify himself were ineffective. The father's remarks sliced through the billionaire's feverish ranting like a knife. "It is too late for that. You cannot purchase your way out of this. Not this time." The billionaire froze, his mouth hanging agape, as the truth of the father's remarks became apparent. There was no escape the consequences of his actions, not with money or excuses. It was over. The father took one last long look at the billionaire, who was still standing there, his eyes wide with desperation, and his hands quivering with the weight of his unsuccessful attempts to avoid the inevitable. The father's stare was steadfast and filled with quiet determination. There was nothing further to say, no more negotiating to be done. The billionaire had made his decisions, and the consequences will follow. Without saying anything, the father lovingly cradled his kid in his arms, his eyes softening as he gazed down at the boy, who had been so strong throughout. He did not need to say anything to his son. His actions spoke louder than words. They'd gone through enough already. The father turned, his movements slow and methodical, as if to ensure the billionaire grasped the gravity of the situation. The billionaire, now paralyzed in his own panic, watched as the father began to walk away, the gap between them expanding with each step. The billionaire shouted out, his voice quivering, but the father could not return his gaze. "Please don't do this," he yelled, his words ringing in the quiet air, but they were nothing more than a final, desperate plea for mercy. The father did not respond. He did not need to. The choice was made. Justice would take its course, and the billionaire's wealth, power, and arrogance were no longer relevant. He had crossed a line, and now he must face the consequences. With each step, the father and son went away from the mansion, from the chaos and deceit that had engulfed them. The father's back was straight, his pace steady, as if he were going toward a future in which his son would be protected and justice would prevail. Behind them, the billionaire stood alone, the weight of his actions crushing down on him, the implications of his decisions becoming painfully clear. His dominion was collapsing, and there was no escape. The father's footsteps became quieter, but his resolve stayed firm. He had finished what needed to be done. And as they vanished from sight, the father realized that justice had been served, one step at a time. As the father and son walked away from the mansion, the boy clung to his father's side, his small hand secure in the father's firm hold. Despite the frightening incident, the youngster possessed a calm strength that could not be denied. His wide eyes, though still veiled by the shadows of what had just occurred, had a glimmer of resilience that said volumes. The father's heart filled with pride as he stared at his son. He could feel the boy's pulse, which was still pounding from the adrenaline of the attack. But there was something else in his eyes, something other than terror. There was a quiet fearlessness, a desire to go forth, regardless of the cost. The youngster had been shaken, of course. The dread of the dog attack, the commotion caused by the billionaire's arrogance, and the overpowering emotions of the day all weighted heavily on his small shoulders. Despite all, he had not broken. He had remained strong, even as everything around him seemed to crumble. The father softly grasped his son's hand, providing wordless reassurance. He could feel the boy's strength, even in their quiet moments together. The father was aware that, despite the stress, his son was already healing. His resilience could not be taken away. It was ingrained in his spirit. As they walked, the child's steps got more steady, as did his breathing. The tears had dried up, giving way to a peaceful determination to put the worst behind him. He looked up at his father, and for the first time since the attack, there was a gleam of calm in his eyes. The father knelt to meet him at eye level, stroking a strand of hair off his son's forehead. "You're okay," he replied softly, his voice full of compassion. "You're safe now." The child nodded, his lips shaking briefly before he recovered his voice. "I'm not scared anymore, Daddy," he muttered, his words simple yet powerful, beyond his years. The father's heart overflowed with love and appreciation. He realized that, while the scars from that day would take time to erase, his son had already demonstrated his resilience to the world, and with his father's help, the youngster would overcome this, stronger than ever. They marched on together, putting the shadows of the past behind them, confident that whatever obstacles lied ahead, they would face them together. The father was unwavering in his strength, and the son had the resilience to get through anything. As they walked away from the billionaire's estate, the father's protective instinct remained unwavering. His arm was tightly wrapped around his son, his movements deliberate and firm, as if the weight of the world couldn't slow him down. Every part of him was concentrated on one goal: keep his son safe at all costs. The father's eyes, always calm and serene, were now filled with a strong determination. He had always understood that being a parent meant more than just providing for his child. It meant standing firm in the face of peril, delivering steadfast protection when the world appeared uncertain. And today, That protection had been put to the test in ways he had never anticipated. Regardless of the difficulties, he would always be there for his son. The boy, still reeling from the shock, looked up to his father with a mix of trust and admiration. The youngster could feel the depth of his father's love and the strength in his presence. It was the type of love that didn't require words. It was sensed in every gesture and step they took together. As they traveled, the father's mind raced with all he would do to keep his son safe. The world was a terrible place, and while he couldn't hide his child from every harm, he would move mountains to keep him safe from the worst. The notion of what could have happened, what almost did happen, made his chest constrict, but he refused to let terror take hold. His resolve was unshakable. The father looked down at his son, his heart full of pride. He saw the boy's quiet fortitude and tenacity, which fueled the father's determination. Nobody, not even the millionaire with all his wealth and power, would ever harm his child again. The father had already made certain of that. "Don't worry, son," he continued, his voice soft yet forceful. "I will always defend you. Whatever it takes, I will never allow anyone damage you." The youngster nodded, his small hand holding his father's somewhat tighter. His father's words of reassurance brought him peace and a sense of security that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Nothing else mattered to the youngster when he was with his father. The father's love for his son was more powerful than everything the world could hurl at them. It was the kind of love that could move mountains and withstand any storm. And as they moved on, the father knew that no matter what obstacles arose, he would meet them with unshakable love and a steadfast commitment to protect his son. Because he believed that there was no greater mission in life than to ensure his child's safety, no matter what the odds were. The billionaire's world began to disintegrate as he lost sight of his father and kid. The confident, untouchable man, who had formerly governed his world with arrogance and authority, now stood on the verge, staring into the abyss of his own demise. The weight of his acts, the crimes he had thought he could hide behind his wealth, became all too real. Within hours, the news spread. The FBI had initiated a complete investigation into the billionaire's criminal dealings, including money laundering, fraud, and the underworld of corruption that he had long concealed under the veneer of grandeur. The truth, long hidden beneath layers of lies and deception, surfaced in a flood of headlines, each more damning than the last. The billionaire's name, which was once associated with accomplishment, has now become a symbol of greed and betrayal. His face, which had previously appeared on magazine covers and business reports, was suddenly splattered throughout news outlets, along with bombshell information about his criminal empire. The public's opinion of him, based on years of admiration and envy, disintegrated in an instant. In the blink of an eye, his enormous money began to slip through his fingers. The luxurious automobiles, houses, and private aircraft all became emblems of his demise, reminders of the life he had built on deception. His once thriving firms were now facing litigation, investigations, and a loss of investor faith. The kingdom he had spent decades building was collapsing before his eyes. His phone constantly rang, but each call felt like a death sentence. His lawyers, accountants, and closest allies all withdrew themselves, unable to aid him. People who had formerly kissed his feet turned their backs, refusing to interact with a man whose misdeeds were being exposed for everyone to see. As the legal ramifications loomed, the billionaire was compelled to confront the realities of his condition. Arrest warrants were issued, his assets frozen, and his enterprises confiscated. The walls he had carefully erected around himself, composed of money and influence, were falling, leaving him exposed and defenseless. The billionaire's once perfect reputation was in shambles. His name, once pronounced with admiration, was now whispered with contempt. The individuals he had looked down on, those he had discarded as beneath him, suddenly stood above him, watching his world crumble. In the end, the billionaire's wealth, power, and arrogance could not shield him from the consequences of his decisions. The police had caught up with him, and there was no escape the consequences. The empire he had built on dishonesty and deception was now reduced to ashes, a warning tale for anybody who believed they could evade justice.